Farm owner humiliates his worker, never imagining years later he'd become a millionaire. He started his day before the sun rose. Still dark, he was already in the corral, cleaning cattle manure while the smell of wet grass mixed with the sweat dried from the night before. His calloused hands no longer hurt. They'd gotten used to it, just like his heart, which seemed to have learned to take the blows in silence. Valentin was that kind of man. He worked, but he didn't speak. He provided, but he stayed invisible. On the ranch, everyone saw him, but no one really saw him. They passed him like he was a fence post. Sometimes they'd say good morning, but without expecting an answer, just automatic politeness. The boss called him Kid. The other ranch hands called him the Quiet One. Nobody knew his last name. Nobody knew how many kids he had. Nobody knew that every night he returned to a makeshift room where 2 children slept on thin mats, and a woman shared the silence with him. Clara. She knew him. She could count every new wrinkle on his face. She knew when he swallowed back tears. She knew that behind that tired look there was a man fighting every day not to collapse. It was an ordinary night. Youngest daughter Isabella slept clutching the ragdoll Clara had sewn from scraps. Lucas, the older one, did his homework at a makeshift desk made from a fruit crate. Valentin sipped lukewarm coffee with no sugar. He smiled when he saw his children. Small gesture, but genuine. It was little, but it was peace, until the explosion. At dawn, the foreman's shout cut through the darkness. "The office money's gone!" They flipped on lights, tore through drawers. The boss arrived with a scowl and clipped words. Nobody slept again. The tension was thick. Everyone gathered in the red dirt yard. The manager appeared holding a stack of bills, wearing a fake look of surprise. "We found it in the night watchman's shed." Silence. Then whispers. Glances. That crowd who once overlooked Valentin now stared at him like he was a criminal. He didn't understand at first. Clara yelled, "That's a lie!" Lucas tried to run to his father, but one of the hands held him back. Isabella cried in confusion. The boss didn't ask for any explanation. He wouldn't listen. He just pointed, "You're fired. Get out of here now." Valentin stood still. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't beg. He just looked around, searching in people's eyes for any sign of doubt, compassion, or memory. But he found only contempt disguised as indifference. They kicked him out like a thief, carrying a bag of clothes and 2 frightened children. Clara by his side, trembling more with anger than with cold. Crossing the ranch gate, no one said a word. No one asked questions. No one reached out a hand. Valentin said nothing either, but something was born inside him. It wasn't hatred, it was certainty, a promise. Cold, silent. He would return. And this time, not as a worker. It wasn't hunger that came first. It was silence, the kind of silence born not from a lack of noise, but from the absence of ground beneath you. From the sudden loss of everything that once felt small, but now meant everything. In the first days, the family slept on bus station benches. Then, in a shelter where the smell of mildew competed with the scent of fading hope. Clara shared a narrow bed with Isabella, who cried for toys that would never return. Lucas slept, curled up against his father's back, and Valentin stayed awake, sitting there, staring at nothing. No home, no voice, no name. It was on one of those nights that Lucas, with tearful eyes, whispered, "Dad, did you steal?" Valentin didn't answer. His throat went dry, his eyes burned, but he stayed silent. He just pulled his son close and held him like someone trying to shield him from the world, even when the world was already inside. The next morning, he left early, just as he had on the ranch, only now with no destination. He offered to carry bags at the market. Most people passed him by as always, without seeing him. Until one weary man let Valentin help him with 2 crates of oranges. In the end, the man paid with coins and said without a hint of irony, "Thanks, brother. God bless you." It was the most humane thing Valentine had heard in weeks. Meanwhile, Clara began cooking with the little she got from the shelter. She made simple meals but packed with love. She walked the streets offering them. Some bought, others pretended she didn't exist. That's how it began. One day at a time, one reel at a time. Valentine continued taking whatever work he could, unloading trucks, cleaning warehouses, stacking boxes. He returned to the shelter exhausted but intact. Though his body ached, his conscience didn't. Until, during one of those cleanups, something changed. While clearing out an abandoned storage room, he spotted a pile of old wood in a corner. Cracked planks, warped pieces, rusty nails. No one cared about it, but he saw what no one else did. He grabbed a piece, sat on an overturned bucket, and with a borrowed pocket knife, he began working, slowly, unhurried, like someone remembering who he was. That night, he came back with hands coated in sawdust. Isabella ran to hug him. Lucas showed off a sketch he'd made in the shelter. Clara smiled with eyes that hadn't seen light in days. Valentine set the piece of wood on the makeshift table. It was just a little stool, crooked, rustic, imperfect, but made by him. With what he had, from scratch, a symbol of everything that was to come. The first stool was only the beginning. In less than a week, there were 3, then 5. Clara could barely keep up with cleaning, packing, and selling. The sidewalk in front became a storefront. The shelter was no longer the only place with a hot meal, and for the first time, the money coming in was earned by their own hands. Valentine discovered that the silence of the woodshop was nothing like the silence of injustice. In that space, every hammer strike was an unspoken word, every piece delivered, a fragment of the past redeemed. It wasn't about making money, it was about rebuilding identity. Lucas started helping with the ledgers and deliveries. Isabella penned sweet notes for customers, made with love by real people. Clara became the bridge between what they'd lost and what they were beginning to gain. She was the negotiator, the one greeting customers with a smile, the one saying "thank you" as though each word restored dignity. It was in that rhythm that the news arrived. One late afternoon, as Valentine was sanding a plank, a newspaper page fluttered onto the workshop floor. He picked it up, dusted it off, and read, "Santa Vittoria Ranch up for auction after financial collapse." Time froze. The rasp of the saw stopped. Clara, seeing the headline, dropped the rag she was holding. It was the same place. That land where he'd given years of hard work, where he'd been treated as invisible, where they judged him not on evidence but on poverty. Valentine stared at the page as if facing a ghost. But his eyes didn't burn with rage. They burned with purpose. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about closing a chapter with his own hands. He didn't tell anyone. Not Clara, not Lucas, not Isabella. Valentine just grabbed his hat, put on a clean shirt, and walked out. Destination. The place where it had all ended. The town looked smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it was him who had grown. He walked the same streets where he'd been expelled once, bag on his back and shame on his face. He passed the store where he used to buy flour on credit, shuttered. The ranch hand's bar, closed. The windows of the ranch house, broken. Weeds claimed the yard. The gate rusted, the horses gaunt. It was no longer a ranch. It was a portrait of the decay of someone who once fancied himself lord of the world. He kept going until he ran into an old friend, Zeka, his former field hand. Older, grease-stained, but with the same good eyes as before. "Valentine!" he blurted, surprised, almost startled. The silence between them stretched for seconds, long enough for Zeka to swallow his guilt and say what had to be said. "Forgive me, brother. We knew it was a setup, but no one had the courage." Valentine stayed quiet, meeting his gaze. Zeka went on. It was the supervisor, Antero. He saw the boss praising you and got scared he'd lose his post. He planted the money in your room and sent an anonymous tip. You were the scapegoat. We all knew. Silence. Valentin closed his eyes, not in anger but relief. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't alone. When he opened them again, his stare was steady. He didn't say, "I'll get revenge." He didn't say, "I'll show them." He just said, "I'm going to buy this land." Zeka thought he'd misheard. Valentin didn't repeat himself. He returned to town, chin up. Clara waited, tense but silent. She knew that look. Lucas looked at his father, and as if he'd been waiting, said, "The time's come, huh?" Valentin nodded, carrying a new weight on his shoulders. This wasn't vengeance. It was justice, served by his own hands. He arrived as always, quiet, unassuming, head held high. The difference this time was the heads up. A buyer wants to see the property. That's what they told the old boss, now worn, weary, drowning in debts he couldn't even add up. He showed up in a fraying vest and scuffed shoes, trying to salvage what little dignity remained. Entering the main room of the old manor, he saw the visitor waiting. He didn't recognize him at first. "Good morning. Interested in the ranch?" Valentin turned slowly, fixing him with the same firm voice as before, only now with resonance. "Yes, I am," he replied. The boss frowned, studied him, and the memory clicked. You're the one..." His voice cracked. He looked away. "Valentin, I didn't know if it was true. Back then, everything moved so fast. Maybe I jumped the gun." Valentin didn't flinch. "You didn't judge me because you thought I was a thief. You judged me because I was poor." Silence. That statement hung in the air like a verdict. No shouts, no recriminations, just the truth, spoken face to face. Sometimes that's more powerful than revenge. "I'm the same man you drove off. The difference is, now I have a voice, and this land will be mine." The old boss swallowed hard, speechless. He had no defense. They signed the contract with the same hand that once cleaned cattle manure in that corral. The same fingers that built furniture from scraps. The same dignity they tried, and failed, to steal. As Valentin stepped out onto the big house's porch, he looked over the fields, the barn, the clothesline, the stretch of earth where they'd chased him off, and thought, "Took me a while, but I'm back, whole." It wasn't a victory, at least not the kind celebrated with fireworks or applause. It was something else. When Valentin walked back through the ranch gate, no one was waiting. The main house was empty, the windows still broken, the fields overgrown. But he didn't see ruin. He saw space to start over. In the weeks that followed, he did what no one expects of a winner. Instead of tearing down, he restored. Instead of forgetting, he remembered everyone. He took the roster of former workers, found those living on handouts, the ones selling candy at traffic lights, the ones dismissed without explanation, knocked on clay brick doors, extended his hand to anyone who'd once wielded a hoe beside him. Many couldn't believe it. "You want to give me a job after everything?" Valentin answered with his usual humility. "I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to fix what was broken." In the new ranch headquarters, the old boss's office became a community dining hall, where injustices were once handed down. Now hot coffee and buttered bread were served. Clara organized everything: ledgers, invoices, inventory, payroll. "Here, no one gets paid last. Here, everyone has a name." Isabella wandered through empty rooms, picked up stray books, gathered broken chalkboards. "Daddy, can I turn this into a school?" Valentin didn't hesitate. "Anything you want. Now it's ours." Lucas drafted the first business plan. "If we do this right, this ranch can be productive and fair. A model." And there, around the same table where warnings were once signed, sat a family. But the story still had a moment no one saw, and maybe it was the most important. One afternoon, two old ranch hands arrived together, shame in their eyes and burdens on their shoulders. The elder whispered, "I believed you were a thief. I stayed silent. Forgive me." Valentine looked him in the eyes. He didn't say, "It's okay," or "Forget it." He simply said, "I know what it's like to stay silent when you should have spoken up. But now, you're here." And he offered his hand. In that instant, more than the ranch purchase, more than any asset, what was restored was something unseen, the bond, collective dignity. At day's end, Valentine walked to the old mango tree, where once he'd wept alone with a broken spirit. Clara followed silently, handing him a young sapling, small, fragile, but alive. Valentine dug into the soil with his bare hands, planted it carefully. Kneeling before the young tree, he whispered, "Now, this is solid ground." That land would never be the same, inside or out. Where once he was driven off as a thief, now grew a nursery of dignity. No luxury, no marketing, just people, and that was enough. The school Isabella dreamed of already had painted walls and children's voices echoing down the halls. She taught for free because she knew the value of what she'd never had: opportunity. Lucas handled everything: spreadsheets, contracts, logistics, supplies. He formed a co-op with local small farmers. Proudly, he told his father, "We're not just paying bills, we're changing lives." Clara was the bridge for everyone, the steady calm behind every decision. And when asked who was in charge, she'd say, "No one is in charge. Everyone takes part." Valentine watched from a distance, as always, but now with something he'd never had: peace. Until one day, a letter arrived. It was from the old ranch family's lawyer. Inside, an offer. They wanted to buy back part of the land. They'd pay well. Valentine read it. He didn't smile. He didn't get angry. He took a pencil and wrote on the back, "Dignity is not for sale." Folded the note, handed it to Lucas. Returned to work. That same late afternoon, he gathered the family on the porch of the main house. "We started here sweeping pig pens. Now we plant knowledge, food, and respect. But all of this only matters if we never forget where we came from." Isabella took a photo. Lucas framed it at the school with a simple caption, "Here, the future began." And like everything strong, the ending didn't come with shouts. It came with silence, but not the silence of pain, the silence of completeness. Valentine walked to the mango tree he'd planted, now with new leaves, green promises swaying in the breeze, looked to the horizon, and thought, "One day they took everything from me, but they couldn't take who I am." He tipped his hat, gave a faint smile, and headed home, because the land was his. But what he'd gained was so much more. If this story reminded you that dignity isn't lost, it's only rebuilt, comment, resist, leave a like and subscribe. Not for me, but for all the stories that still need to be told. Thank you for being here. See you next time.